Right. Good morning. Good afternoon. Professor Tom Berry here. Tom. Yeah, we're about halfway through the term, right? Finished up the midterm, kind of got grounded in a lot of different theories, concepts, according to the big picture, kind of what is sociology. Really, it's kind of understand it now. It's like this sort of unpacking of human behavior, the relationship between humans and environment, thinking about that complex relationship, and it is complex. It is a lot of variables, a lot of things going on to try to understand social systems, social structure, groups, the individual, human behavior. It's a lot of stuff. And sociology draws upon a lot of disciplines. Having a background in history, understanding um, social psychology, anthropology, culture. There's just so many things to unpack, and we're going to continue on the journey now that we've been grounded in some core concepts, theories, and ideas. Moving into some more narrow topics, we're going to go into this week social stratification, looking at class and wealth, and then moving into racial stratification, gender stratification, and then a series of smaller topics as we move forward. So with that, let's kind of get started. Kind of the goal of the presentation here is to kind of, I don't know, provide some different additional information, perspective as you kind of work through the chapter on stratification, try to make it a little bit more accessible, understandable, and just kind of isolate some kind of core ideas about stratification. So stratification, if you kind of think about it, this is a picture out in John Day, the Painted Desert. It's all these different layers. Stratification is a layering. It's sort of a ranking. And different cultures and societies have different degrees of stratification. And even within a nation, it changes over time. So it's a very dynamic process. So the kind of couple questions asked is, well, from the top to the bottom, why is it that way? Nothing is natural, nothing is inevitable, nothing has to be any particular way. If we only look at that sort of free will individual effort, we looked at that lens, well, stratification is just the result of individuals doing or not doing certain things. And it's a matter of choice. That's missing from the picture. What's missing from that picture is an examination of a lot of stuff that's going on in history, culture, whether we're looking at from a functionalist perspective or a conflict theory perspective. There's so much more going on that leads to degrees of stratification than just an individual effort alone. So defining it, right? So we already defined it, kind of like, okay, it's categorizing people. There's a hierarchy. One way of stratification, if we're looking at class and wealth, we're looking at wealth, status, power. We could look at racial stratification as well, gender stratification. But in this case, social stratification, we're talking about wealth and income and status and power. So a couple different principles of stratification, characteristics. It's universal. Every nation, there's stratification, but it's variable. So it's variable within a nation, across time, and it's variable kind of across nations. What's maybe kind of like, well, obvious, things are going to be variable. But the question again becomes, well, how is it, why is it, and to what degree are things variable across nations? And that's where the fun and where the interesting things kind of lie. Stratification is also very persistent. It's difficult to change degrees of stratification. Over the last 40 years in the United States and a lot of other high-income countries, the rate of stratification has increased. A lot of people are concerned about the degree of stratification in contemporary societies. That this has a lot to do with globalization, technology, population growth and movement and development, population development and movement. So a lot of different factors related to that. It's very difficult to change degrees of stratification, but it can be changed. It's not inevitable. And then it's supported by a belief system. So if you have stratification, think about it. So if you have we have our cultural ideal, our practice, or our ideal culture is this idea of, equality of opportunity for everyone. You think that we'd be in a country that there's an incredible amount of social mobility, but there's discrimination, there's inequities, there's class disparities that are going on within our nation too. So to maintain a system of significant inequality requires some justification for it. Otherwise, there'd be a movement for change. People would be advocating advocating at the government level, their state level for making change. And I mean, there is that class consciousness. People do advocate for change. But it's very, if you looked at the numbers and the degree of stratification, and, while there's kind of rumblings going on about concerns of stratification, it is just so difficult to change. It's persistent, and it's supported by that belief system. And we'll talk about some of those beliefs. Different theoretical perspectives. We'll talk about three of them. Talk about the Durkheim or functionalist perspective, the Marxist, Marx perspective, and Weber. I mean, functionalist has a view that stratification is valuable. It has a function, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Marx's position is that that stratification is related to whether you are an owner or you are a worker. I mean, that's when he was writing in the 1800s, early industrialization. This idea that those who were in the positions of power were the owners, and then there were the workers. And it's your relationship to what he called the modes of production, whether you're an owner or a worker. You're an owner, you're the bourgeoisie. You're a worker, you're the proletariat. And that sets up the sort of class dynamic. Weber had something a little bit different to offer. He thought that stratification is a result of three different elements. It's prestige or status of a position. So let's say it's seventh grade teacher versus in comparison to someone who's working in the trades, who's an auto mechanic. The mechanic may make more money than the teacher, but there's a prestige value that's attached, that culture attaches to the teacher in a different way than the auto mechanic. So for Weber, status and prestige was important. Power was important. The ability to shape or an influence, like that was a factor. And then class position. So Weber brought culture into the perspective more than Marx than Marx did. Different kinds of stratification. This is just like, to understand that we have a class system today, like the United States, we're based on a class system. Industrial revolution moved us towards that much more class-based system. And this is kind of a diagram, a Marxist kind of view of a class system. You have capitalism, which is the system of organization. We have those who are creating the ideology, or those who are in seats of power, those who are the leaders of industry and government, the way of power, and the way that power influences the social structure. Have those who basically create and support the ideology that helps support the system. Have the state apparatus, who helps to establish control. Then you have the bourgeoisie, who enjoy all the pleasures of the system. And then at the bottom are all the workers. That's kind of like a Marxist class-based kind of system analysis. And then prior to class-based system, like looking at Europe, for example, and other nations, that you have this sort of, is a monarchy system, a feudal system, where there was a stratification, kings and queens at the top, peasants at the bottom, stratification. It's a different way of organization. And then you have a caste-based system, like India is probably the most well-known example of a caste-based system, an organized structure, different positions in society that were supported by ideology. People who were born into a caste position stayed there throughout the duration of their life. So there were the top Brahmins, who were priests and teachers, all the way to the bottom, the outcast. And there was a ranking system that was established and formally established and supported by ideology. Now, we have a class system in the United States, but there are some challenges to that. I mean, the question arises is, well, we have a class system, but we have some remnants of the caste system too. So there are things that are putting limits on people's ability to move. If we look at race as an example, I think there's some podcasts with Isabel Wilkerson talking about her work on caste. I think it's really provocative if you're interested in kind of looking at race and racial inequality, looking at the caste system, the class and the relationship between class and race. That we have caste-like features in the United States, although we tend to ignore that. We think of ourselves as being much more of just a class-based system. Michelle Alexander, this years ago, wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, and identifying or talking about how the criminal justice system in some ways operates as a new form of regulation and control, that helps to maintain a caste system along racial lines. This is an image of 1950s, the development of suburbia and residential segregation. I mean, that during that time period, a practice called redlining that we'll talk about later on next week. And like that's, you know, like an example of there's some caste-like elements in the United States. The Green Book is an example of a reflection of the caste-based system. So we had in the United States starting in late 1800s, all the way to 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, and even after. So we had legal segregation in the United States. The Green Book was a book for Black motorists, people who are traveling or travelers, traveling throughout the United States, throughout the South. The Green Book was a guide, like where to go, that you could actually go to a restaurant or accommodations. Because of that system of segregation, that legal segregation that was there, that this was a resource for people to navigate within that particular system. Powerful film, I think, called The 13th. It's a documentary looking at the criminal justice system and race, kind of really provocative if you're interested in that. And then the two pictures here about South Africa. And South Africa had a formal apartheid system, a caste system, similar to the United States in terms of Jim Crow in the South. And it's like, you know, when South Africans declared their freedom from that system or movement away from that system, is a major revolution that happened in a documentary called Amandla that kind of follows that. Yeah, here's like, so if I go back and go, okay, yeah, it's universal and variable. So it's kind of provide some examples of this. You don't need to know the data points here just to kind of illustrate. There's a measurement called the Gini coefficient. It's a measurement of degree of inequality. The higher the number, the more unequal a nation is. And you can just kind of see, here's the United States, we're at 0.39. Perfect inequality is 1. Perfect equality is 0. So the further you move up, it's more unequal. And you can see it's variable, right? Not every nation is structured the same way. One other way of looking at the universal and variable component is degree of social mobility, the ability of people to move up and down in terms of social class position. Some of the countries that are the most where there's the most mobility, where the class position you're born into has less of an influence on where you end up in life, are the Nordic countries, Western European countries. The United States, there's mobility for sure, a lot more mobility than in other countries. The darker the color, the more mobility there is. We rank 27 in terms of all these different countries, high-income countries. We rank 27th in terms of degree of social mobility, which tells us there's something going on in the structure that's influencing the ability of people to move across class positions. A couple different examples that, you know, of maybe some culture or why things are the way that they are and how they maintain. Look at marginal tax rate or tax rates for individuals who are at the top of the tax bracket. During after the Depression, all the way until through the World War II, post-World War II, the top tax bracket was 92, 93, 94%. So a person's income, once they got above a certain amount, it was taxed at 90 some percent. Now the top marginal tax rate is like 38%. Well, it's variable, right? It's moving across time and place. It's political. It's not inevitable. It's a reflection of our cultural values a little bit. But that's just kind of like to demonstrate that, man, stratification changes and shifts. Tax codes change and shift based on the times and whatever's going on. Another example would be like looking at, I don't know, just kind of interesting to look at the amount of gross domestic product. So all goods and services that are produced in a country, like, okay, the tax revenue of a country as a percentage of the total productivity. A lot of other countries, you know, they have higher tax rates, right? So there's lots going back into the economy based on taxes. All these different countries have a fairly high amount of tax revenue, or in relationship to the GDP, much bigger share. So being able to provide more services and more things through the government to be able to do that. We have a relatively low percentage of our GDP is coming from taxes. So it's variable. Okay, so let's talk about now about, so we have a system of stratification. It's supported by ideology. So we have an ideology of the American dream, for example, the belief that anyone, regardless of what position you're born into, has the ability to move themselves in any other position. There's some truth to that. It's not like there's no truth to that. People do that, but it's this ideology, this belief that everybody is capable, or everybody has the opportunity. There's no restrictions. It's all up to the individual to be able to get to where they need to go. Then there's some critique of that. I don't know if everyone, there's been in recent years, 2008 with the housing bubble crisis, concerns about economic inequality. There's, is the American dream even there? Is it over? Well, it's still the ideology, regardless of an individual's view of that. It's still an ideology. It's hegemonic, and we'll talk about hegemony. I think it's important to think about self-determination, that people making choices, right? The individual within an environment and context. Different people have different choices available to them, and it's kind of unpacking that and thinking that. The American dream, the question, was it ever the order of the day? If you go back and look at racial inequality and racial injustice and discrimination and gender discrimination, the American dream wasn't available to everyone. Look at, indigenous communities in the United States. I mean, there's restrictions, there's limitations, but it's this dominant ideology and dominant belief that we have. And it leads to things like this, where Amazon, for example, paid no federal income taxes for a period of time. I think they paid federal income taxes a few different times, but it's a relatively small part of their overall profits. Raises a question about, okay, is this really a system that's based on fairness and equity, different rules for different groups and institutions? Is that American dream even? There's some cracks or major gulfs in the American dream idea. So the ideology, here's kind of an explanation of ideology as a lens through which people view the world. Within the field of sociology, we use this term quite a bit. Refers to the total sum of people's values, their beliefs, their assumptions, their expectations. Like, why do people think things are the way that they are? Ideologies exist within society, within groups of people, between people. Individuals have their own ideology that they develop. The reason why sociologists pay attention to it a lot because it plays a significant role in justifying or explaining the system that we are in. So it can help maintain a system of equality, can help prevent us from moving to that kind of ideal culture that we that is a strong cultural value. So the idea of hegemony, domination by consent, that to maintain that system of inequality requires acceptance from the general population. So the general public allows for the wealthy. We support the wealthy not paying a higher tax rate. A lot of Americans, regardless of class position, will support policies that go against their own economic interest. And that's an example of hegemony. People accepting ideologies and views that are against their own economic interest in doing so. Maybe another thing to think about, I don't know, it's kind of an interesting concept called the just world hypothesis, is that there's struggle going on. There's inequality, there's injustices going on, and it's a lot for humans individually to handle and to to live with. And so there's a tendency for humans to believe that the world is a just place. Not that people deserve kind of what necessarily all that they get, whether they're poor or that they're rich, but we have a tendency to say, we see kind of struggle going on and we see hardship, we feel disempowered to do anything about it. And we start to develop an explanation that the world, it's unfortunate, but that's just kind of the way things are. The world is this place that people need to navigate on their own and figure it out. There's nothing that individually that we can do. So it gives us this just world belief, helps to maintain this particular system. So the theory provides the idea that when people fall victim to misfortune, others tend to look at things that might explain their circumstances. So people have a tendency to look for something or someone to blame. Well, the reason that they're poor, for example, is because they made bad decisions, or whatever those decisions may be, or the reason people are wealthy is because they made the right decisions. They're more moral, they have stronger values, these kind of things. So simply, rather than thinking about things like bad luck or discrimination or inequities, people tend to look for at the individual level, individual behavior to explain away or explain why people are in the circumstances that they are. It leads people to think that when good things happen to people, it's because those people are deserving of it. And then the other end, when bad things happen, it's because people are deserving of that as well. And this becomes kind of a challenge, right? So on the one level, it's like hegemony, this dominant view that people tend to accept ideas that go against their economic interests. And then we also have this idea, the just world hypothesis, that humans have a tendency to want to, it's so hard to look at that inequality that we tend to want to believe that the world is a more just place than it actually is. I can't share this video with you because then it'll come, when I post this video online, it'll come back copyright violation. But if you're interested, there's some videos out there just kind of explaining the just world hypothesis. So you can, view that if you would like. Think about, okay, well, how does mobility actually match reality? We like the story of the rags to riches story. The old story in the past was Oprah Winfrey, a media icon who went from rags to riches, grew up in Chicago in an impoverished environment, became really incredibly wealthy and a powerful voice for a lot of different cultural voice in the United States. We tend to believe and latch onto these sort of rags to riches story, but that's so far from reality of how things actually are. And then there's differences. This is kind of interesting about how do people see, why are people rich? Why are people poor? If you look at based on income level, people think that, 43% on average believe that people are rich because they worked harder than others to be able to get there. It's a split, like, 42% see, well, there's things that they had advantage and privilege, like that's part of it too. Interesting, the more the lower economic level recognize or identify the privileges that are there. For those who have make more money, tend to focus more on the hard work. I find it kind of interesting looking at compared to why are people poor. This is what I find interesting is that we look at individuals who are experiencing poverty, and we recognize the structural challenges that they are living in or grew up in and that they are surrounded by. And that becomes like, we recognize that. But when it moves to the wealthy, we see it as more of an individual worked harder kind of thing. It's like, well, that's kind of interesting in and of itself. Like, why do we have this sort of different view and different perspective, different perception of why people are in those positions? Americans tend to have this very, very individualistic, rags to riches, free will, work hard, you'll get there. Like that becomes our dominant ideology. This is a study, it's almost 10 years ago now, of a lot of different countries asking questions about, what influenced people to end up where they are? Percent who disagree that success in life is determined by things that are outside of their control. So disagree. So Americans tend to disagree that things are outside of people's control. I mean, a lot of other countries recognize that those things are outside of one's control are powerful forces. Percent who say it's very important to work hard to get ahead. I mean, the United States is kind of an outlier. We tend to see it as it's working hard gets you to where you need to be. Americans' perception of distribution. So this is like a picture of, well, actually, maybe start here. So this research study, again, click on this video. It's a really interesting video. It gives you like all these graphs in a very dynamic way to see that concentration of wealth over time. And it's really eye-opening to see the degree of inequality over a course of time. Americans, so the question asked in the survey was asking Americans, okay, so what is the ideal? If you're going to have an ideal society, what is the distribution of wealth in that society? How do you see it? And this is the ideal that people think is where it should be. There is some degree of inequality that's based on some people are working harder than others. Some people bring more talent. They're more involved in certain things that are producing greater economic value to the country, whatever it may be. But they see this as the ideal if there's some degree of inequality. Then what Americans actually think it is. So What are people's perceptions? Okay, this is what they want. They think it should be. People see, they think it's, well, yeah, it's more unequal than I think it should be. So that's kind of a general. But then you kind of look at the actual, and Americans' perception of the reality is so different than the actual. We're much more highly concentrated wealth and income than Americans tend to believe and recognize. And that, I think, creates some challenges and problems, because if you don't understand the degree of inequality, if our perceptions are off, it's going to lead to certain kinds of outcomes as a result. And there are differences. Republicans and Democrats see the world in a different way. So Republicans tend to see that the person is poor because of lack of effort, much more of a conservative view than a liberal view. The liberals tend to see more of the structure. The Republicans tend to see more it's because of lack of effort. But then you can look at it, it's kind of interesting that the rich are there because they worked harder. This is what's kind of, again, fascinating to me. There's sort of a different view of those who are poor versus those who are rich. And it's like, how do we account for that? That we kind of see there's this tendency to see the wealthy, even for liberals, Democrats, to see the wealthy as more deserving of kind of where they are at. Different theories of stratification. You got the functionalist view, that the functionalist view is that there's stratification, it's universal, it has to have a function. You have some jobs, there needs to be a greater compensation because of their contribution back to society itself. Maybe it's the degrees of education, maybe it's the value of the work, maybe it's the complexity of the work, maybe it's the importance of that work to society, but there needs to be a system of different rewards for the job in order to promote people being dedicated to be able to do those kind of things. One example, looking at a physician at a family practice, what an individual makes versus a nurse versus a home health aide, different levels of education. Now you could, different levels of education, responsibility, and different wages as a result. Now you could kind of critique that a little bit. Okay, well, does that family physician, that family practice physician making almost 9 times the amount as the home health aide, or 8 times, is that functional? Is that a reflection of, do we need that degree of different rewards in order to justify that? That's a different question, but the Davis Moore thesis, the functionalist view, is you need to have those differential rewards in order to promote dedication into those certain kind of jobs. Again, you could raise a question like the average worker versus the average CEO in 2020 was 271. The average CEO made 270 times the amount of the average worker. Raises the question about whether this viewpoint has its limitations. Like, can we really justify that 270 to 1? In the 1970s, that rate of the CEO to the average worker was 70 to 1. So it's very, stratification is variable. Something changed along the way. So how do we explain that? Conflict theory is about means of production. Okay, well, how do we think about stratification as related to people's access to resources and where they sit in that system? Are they a worker or are they an owner? So unions are a way for labor to be represented, for workers to be represented. And countries with higher union rates tend to have better working conditions, higher wages, greater compensation, greater benefits. So we look at union membership rate in different countries. The United States, we have one of the lowest, if not the lowest, union membership rate. The majority of that 11% are in the public sector, so law enforcement, teachers, people working for government, and a smaller part in the private sector. So we have very oppositional in American culture to private unions in private industries. There's been movement recently for United Auto Workers, for Amazon, for workers, Starbucks, for workers to become unionized, but we have this cultural space and historical space that limits the ability for people to become unionized. Then as a result, we get different kind of things. Greater union representation is correlated with things like more paid vacation days. I mean, Sweden, 25 days. Germany, it's a capitalist country. Socially democratic country. Just in the United States, there's a blend. It's a mixed economy. There's a lot. We don't have any guaranteed actually paid vacation days in the United States. It's a benefit that employers provide, but it's not federally required. So you can kind of go through. We're the only country that doesn't have any paid maternity leave, paid family medical leave. And this becomes kind of like, kind of an issue from a conflict theory viewpoint. On an interesting comparison, I started thinking about this, that minimum wage $13.50 an hour. If you worked, so it's about $28,000 a year. If we looked at at the college, at Central Oregon Community College, the president makes, I got misspelled there. President makes makes about $220,000 a year, about 8 times the average worker at the college. Now look at a CEO, 270 times. Like, man, that's a big difference going on between the two. All right, so another theory, this one's a little bit difficult, more difficult to kind of get at. It's called social reproduction by a theorist called Pierre Bourdieu. And it's an interesting example of interactionism and how it relates to social structure. There's a lot of videos about Bourdieu and social reproduction, so if you want, just go out there and look for them, you'll find them. His idea is that the class position that we grow into, or the groups that we're in, we learn certain ways of thinking, certain mannerisms, certain tastes, certain things that give us privilege or advantage or help secure our position as we move throughout life. So stratification is socially reproduced. It's moving away from looking at the structure. It's looking at, well, if you grow up in a family with a lot of wealth and you've gone on you've gone on a lot of vacations where you go for travel. What is your language, your body communication being influenced by class? What your things that we talked that Bourdieu talked about, cultural capital, your understanding of, for example, like your language, your style, your appearance, the clothes that you wear, knowing like it fits in with that sort of upper class style. There's you learn that as you're growing up in that space, thinking about how we manage conflict or how we take on leadership roles and how our communication skills and style, our human relation skills, that all this is being learned within a cultural context. Not that people can't acquire that if they're in a different class position, but it's what Bourdieu is interested in, is looking at how class is influencing the development and the acquisition of cultural capital. And then we use that capital to exchange it for jobs and occupations and other things. So cultural capital is kind of the what you know. Social capital is who you know. So social capital, we can exchange that too, right? So somebody who is in a family with doctors and lawyers and other individuals in the middle to upper class, if they're in a family, if they're a kid growing up in that environment, they're exposed to a lot of cultural capital stuff, but also have networks. I mean, the parents have networks. So helping to influence the opportunities for their children. The kids have access to a social network for employment, for opportunities. So it's happening. What Bourdieu is interested in, it's happening within in our space, right, of where we grow up. I'm not going to spend the time here talking about Annette Leroux, but it's a great example of her talking about unequal childhoods that is being reproduced. She does like an ethnographic work. She's interviewing people in the working class, the middle upper class, spending time with them, looking at the dynamics of family life and how in that family life helps to reproduce inequality. Her perspective is that there's no parenting style that's better or worse than the other. Parents parents are loving parents and, loving their kids and providing the best support that they can in that context. The question she starts to raise and what she looks at is the ways in which there's systematic advantage by growing up in a upper middle class family, knowing how to navigate systems, for example. Okay, let's talk about the myth of meritocracy. So meritocracy is the idea that we live in a society that's based on, that outcomes are based on merit, how hard you work, your level of education, your knowledge, your skills. The more of those things you have, the further you move up. So there's a myth to this. So there's this belief that we tend to have that those who are at the top are more deserving. They have more merit. And this is why that they're in a higher position in society. This term actually comes out in the 1950s. Michael Young, he was a Labor Party voice, and he was concerned about, in the 1950s in England, about there was growing inequality, and there was a belief that that people were getting further along because of merit. There was a belief that it was due to merit. And he was questioning that. And he was trying to provide sort of a viewpoint that merit, this idea that it's based on merit, is a faulty one. It's a limited one. There may be a little bit of grain of truth to it, but it's a limited one. If you look at, like, in the night starting, this is, maybe well before your time, but the globalization really took off in the night. I mean, this new era of globalization, mass trade, increased technology, started in the 1970s, 1980s, that it created or resulted in significant degrees of inequality. And politicians in the United States and other countries, their response to that was go get more education. Like that's what we need to do, is focus on providing more opportunities for education. And so what it says is that the more credentials you have, the more merit you have, you'll be able to make it in this new economy. Well, there's some limits to that kind of view. It's not looking at the overall structure, and we have a challenge within our structure that's being ignored. The meritocracy idea minimizes the issue of luck. And Michael Sandel, who does a lot of interesting work on this idea of meritocracy, the injustice of believing this idea of meritocracy. And I think it provides a provocative idea that sometimes it's just luck where we end up. I mean, luck of who we come in contact with. We're at the right place at the right time. And Americans, the survey information data would say Americans tend to undervalue or under-identify the role that luck plays. Sometimes it's just luck. He uses the example, if you are an amazing athlete, it happens to be that you are this amazing, say a basketball player, a female or male basketball player, you happen to be this basketball player at this moment in time in this culture that's compensating at a particular level. That's just kind of luck. Women's tennis, Billie Jean King helped to bring gender equity within the majors in tennis, so that all male and female winners at the majors starting, I don't know what year it was, but probably 1970s, 1980s, is when Billie Jean King was active in trying to change that structure and say, hey, female athletes need to be compensated. Their compensation should be the same as male. The male winners, men's tennis, should be compensated the same. So I guess what I'm getting at here is, if you were a female if you were a female tennis star in the 1960s or even the 1970s, you were in a different structure than a woman tennis player today. It's just luck. It just happens to be luck, and Americans tend to undervalue that or undersee that. So if we believe the myth, it kind of tends to justify the inequality itself. This is just a quick chart to identify that, where 25-year-olds went to school based on parental income. So if we look at, the bottom 20%, where do people go to school? Almost 40% not in college, going to different occupations, different choices. Nothing wrong with that at all in any sort of way. Just trying to look at and examine how that income influences selection of college, for example, and what people do in terms of their choice in life. I'm going to bypass these just for time's sake. We're going to move on to structural inequality and structural social mobility. I think a really important concept that with globalization, going back like 1970s, 1980s, and other terms called deindustrialization, so that our manufacturing centers, Americans used to produce much more manufactured goods than we do today. We've moved to a service-based economy and decreased our focus on manufacturing. So deindustrialization happened starting in the 70s and the 80s. Part of it's due to technological advancement, new technologies in industry. Part of it's due to globalization and trade policies, North America Free Trade Agreement, different trade agreements where we're moving manufacturing to different countries. A lot of argument or perspective that this benefits corporations at the cost of workers. We also have a cultural environment that is oppositional to unions at a Supreme Court level, all the way through political level. So this environment, something happened to the structure of society that's resulted in declining mobility for more people. So think about it that way, right? It's not an individual level examination of mobility. It's a structural examination of mobility. Like something's happened with the structure. And I'm sure maybe you've had conversations with your parents or grandparents that, man, the life they grew up in is different than the life you're growing up in. Like something happened to the structure. Affordable housing, I'm not going to say it wasn't an issue in the past. It was an issue in the past for some, but it's much more of a prominent issue today. Something happened in the structure. So it's like a sociological imagination, right? If we're only looking at the individuals, we tend to blame individuals for kind of where they're at versus having more of a thoughtful perspective, a more imaginative perspective, and thinking about the structure of society itself. Interesting book called When Work Disappears by William Julius Wilson, Harvard sociologist. Not that Harvard matters, but he like looks at different cities in Baltimore, Chicago, and looks at what happens when work disappears and the impact on those communities. So when manufacturing jobs are leaving these communities, poverty, crime, other things happen, inequality increases in these communities, and there's detrimental or consequences to that. And that's a reflection of structural changes. A little bit closer to home, Nicholas Kristof, who wrote this book called Tightrope about Yamhill. He grew up in Yamhill, Oregon, near the coast, and the time when he grew up there in the 1960s, maybe, when he was probably in high school, young adult, and he goes back there today, and it's just a different world today. There was a manufacturing plant there. That manufacturing plant left. Different kind of economy today. People who could afford to leave or had the support to leave moved to Portland metro area or other places where there are more jobs, leaving individuals, less economic opportunity in the community that was there. So I don't know, just kind of an interesting kind of focus of thinking about the structure of society itself. And this kind of explains like the gap between the top and the bottom. So looking at the gap between the top and the bottom in 1970 versus today, like there's been a growing gap between the top and the bottom. Share of income in the United States, 50%. So the top percent have upper income. It's almost 50% of the total income in the United States is in the top group, the upper 20%. Top 1% has a significant amount of income, percentage of income in the United States. Quick interview. If you're interested in an interview, just type in Nicholas Kristof, Tightrope. You'll probably get video, or you can go to this PowerPoint video and look at that video, him talking about the work, that work. Our Towns, an interesting documentary in HBO. It's looking at towns that reinvented themselves after losing their manufacturing jobs. And Bend, Central Oregon, but really Bend is profiled. It's the last city that's profiled in this film. And they're talking about this transition in Bend from, the mill and manufacturing center to a service-oriented vacation spot, and how certain cities were able to transform themselves into a new economy. And it's been a positive thing, but they've emerged from this experience as strong as before. But a lot of cities and towns don't experience that. I don't know, a couple of different things to kind of think about. The college degree. So this is just like the number of people with a bachelor's degree over a period of time, that it's more important to get a college degree to step into the workforce. But think about this for a moment. If we have a lot of inequality, costs more to get a college education, it's going to make there's some pressure points that are going to happen there as a result of that. So if we have the jobs we have today require more education, but not everybody has the same resources to get that education, this is going to be a little bit of a challenge. And I think it kind of questions the idea of meritocracy. I think it would need to challenge our idea, that dominant ideology, and start to kind of like think about more thoroughly about, people's social position and the resources that are available to them to be able to get to move themselves in different places in the economy. This is kind of interesting, looking at those with a high school graduates versus those with a bachelor's degree over time. I just kind of find it interesting. I mean, the gap between those categories are relatively small for those who are growing up, who are part of the silent generation, mid-1960s until the late 1970s. And today that's much more significant, those with a college degree versus those without. So structural things that are going on. This is kind of interesting, I think, too, just as the last thing. The cost of an undergraduate education over a course of time as adjusted for inflation. I mean, it's just more expensive to get a college degree. More students are coming to community college because it's more affordable, and quality education at a community college, and it's accessible for more people versus the amount of money, student debt, all these different things that go along with that. All right, so that's stratification in a nutshell. Hope everything's going well. I'm a resource for you, so if you ever have any questions, let me know. Have a great rest of your day, and yeah, catch you next time.